students of course A403 on Work Values and Ethics, welcome. Today we shall talk about another approach to enhance or to enforce ethical behavior in an organization, which is the integrity approach. Of the basic learning objectives of this chapter is number one, to be able to describe the integrity approach and also to differentiate it from the compliance approach. So the second objective is to be able to describe the difference between the compliance and integrity approaches. Number three is to be able to solve an ethical dilemma using ethical decision making. So, since we are focusing here on the integrity approach and how to encourage people through training and education to start using ethical reasoning, you hopefully would be able to solve an ethical dilemma using ethical decision making. So, we shall know the steps and processes of ethical decision making. And finally, you'd be able to consider the importance of training and education and how training and education can actually enhance ethical behavior inside the organization. As usual, let us start with some of the key terms. Number one is the compliance approaches, which was the subject of the previous chapter. So again, we define the compliance approaches as the use of external controls to control unethical behavior, for example, through the use of laws and regulations. Here, we tend to use external controls that are external to the individual in order to prevent, avoid unethical behavior. Okay? Whereas the integrity approaches use internal controls that stimulate ethical behavior, for example, through the use of training, education, and the integrity of the individual. So here, unlike the case with the compliance approach, we rely on internal controls emanating from the individual himself and his convictions about how to behave ethically. So here we're trying to focus on the positive side, which is the ethical behavior and how to foster it, how to promote it, how to stimulate it. Whereas the compliance approaches focus on the negative aspect, which is the unethical behavior and how to avoid it, how to prevent it, or how also to sanction it. Okay? So here, both are distinct from each other, but again, they complement each other and they resemble two broad views or two broad questions. Are people corruptible and therefore we need to use external controls to control unethical behavior? Or are people good in by nature, okay, and if given the chance they would behave ethically on their own, okay? So this is the case with both types of approaches. Now we move on to responsibility, and responsibility generally involves a kind of accountability and obligation. But here we need to distinguish between objective and subjective responsibility. Objective responsibility from the term, okay, is expectations coming from external stakeholders towards civil servants. Okay, so they are objective in the sense that they do not come or emanate from the individual again. Okay, so actually they are a result of the expectations of other stakeholders. So accordingly, an individual would do his duty only because he knows that other stakeholders are expecting him to do so. Whereas in subjective responsibility, we're talking about one's own feeling towards the duty. So here, the individual himself or herself is convinced that they should do their duties. And somehow we can see that this resonates very much with Mr. Kohlberg's model, right? Remember in the conventional level, when we were talking about people behaving ethically because others expect them to do so, versus the higher level in which people behave ethically because they are convinced that this would lead to the welfare of the society. Okay, so um, it's basically the same or almost similar. When we're talking about objective responsibility, here an individual would behave ethically because other people, other stakeholders expect him to do so, while if he had the subjective responsibility, and here we're talking about subjective, the subject himself, or subjectivism. Remember, one of the views or schools in ethics. So here, the individual or the subject behaves ethically because he is convinced that this would lead to the welfare of the organization or of the society, etc. Okay? Also, since we are differentiating between the compliance approaches and the integrity approaches, then we need to consider external and internal controls. According to the definition of the compliance approach, we said that we would use external controls to control unethical behavior. So, again, these external controls are external to the individual, but they can be imposed by the organization itself. For example, when we talk about rules, procedures, regulations inside the organization, or they can be external or emanating from outside the organization. So here we're like when we are talking about laws that are actually imposed by the legislative body. Okay, so in both cases, whether we're talking about controls imposed by the organization and its management, or we're talking about controls that are imposed by external bodies to the organization, both cases are external to the individual himself because these controls do not emanate from the personality and character of the individual. And in that case, they are considered as imposed on the individual because they do not emanate from this person himself, okay? And they are also considered top down instruments because, again, as I said, the rules and regulations are most probably imposed by the organization's management, even if everybody was involved in setting them, but the final decision comes from the management, the organizational management. So we can consider it to be a top down instrument. Okay, the same thing, of course, applies to the laws that come from the legislative body, which is also one of the top institutions in any country. So it's again a top down instrument. And these seek to steer employee ethical conduct. So they seek to guide, steer, control ethical conduct. This is different from the internal controls that emanate from the individual himself and aim to internalize moral values and foster ethical conduct. So, when we use training, for example, or education, we help people learn about how to solve ethical problems, how to think in an ethical way, how to make ethical decisions, and so on. And by this, we are actually promoting their moral values. We are fostering their moral values and their moral behavior, etc. So, in that sense, you are helping those people to develop morally, right? So, they are internal instruments, not imposed on the individuals. Okay, now we move on to the ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is a situation of conflicting responsibilities or contradictory responsibilities, in which an employee has to make a difficult choice between two sets of moral expectations or values. So there are two sets of moral expectations, like, for example, responsiveness versus efficiency, or equity versus equality, or socio-economic inequality. Remember when we talked about the justice-based school? Okay, and how roles differentiated between equity and socioeconomic inequality. So these sometimes can contradict each other, and so on. And both alternatives um, have significant costs in that sense. For example, if you treat everybody on equal basis, this might be unfair to the hard workers, but a source of happiness for the lazy people, because regardless of what the hard workers would do and so on, the lazy people would still be rewarded in the same way as the hard workers. So this is one of the costs, of course. Whereas when you resort to socioeconomic inequality, where you tend to reward those hard workers more than the lazy workers. Of course, this is fair to the hard workers, but might be a source of dissatisfaction or unhappiness for those lazy workers. So, in that case, you would be put in a position where you can't decide which path or alternative to follow. Okay, of course, the example that I just gave is an easy one, but again, look, for example, at the example of whether curing one patient but it would cost you a lot of money versus curing 10 patients that would not cost you so much, while each of both alternatives has the right for a life, right? So, in that case, such an ethical dilemma would be very inconvenient for the employee, and he would be put in an awkward position where he would have to decide how to behave. And each of these alternatives would have a significant cost, of course. For example, if he decided that the patient um, that requires a very expensive operation but has waited so many years until um, he had the chance to get operated, this of course would deprive 10 other patients from maybe the surgery. Okay, whereas if you um, actually cure the 10 patients, then you are actually violating the right of life of this first patient. So it's actually an awkward position. Ethical dilemmas are very difficult and are awkward in their sense. Finally, we need to resort to ethical decision making model, which is a pragmatic and systematic way of reasoning or of ethical deliberation to help you solve an ethical dilemma. So, here you would learn about the different steps to go through in order to make an ethical decision. Chapter starts by distinguishing between the integrity approach and the compliance approach. The first one, of course, the integrity approach uses internal control versus the compliant approach that uses external controls. Um, of course, both approaches tend to be different and they may be at opposing ends of the same spectrum. However, they should not be considered as mutually exclusive, that you have to adopt one of both. No, they are actually complementing each other. So an organization can, in fact, apply both approaches simultaneously. Um, The underlying idea of the integrity approach, which is the main subject of this chapter, is that officials should be able to make ethical decisions autonomously without any instruments imposed on them, and that they are good by nature. Okay, so they can make accordingly ethical decisions in an autonomous way and based on sound ethical arguments because they can use ethical reasoning and deliberation and they can be intrinsically motivated to do the right thing. So, here, according to the integrity approach, we believe in the good nature of the individuals. And we believe that if people were left on their own and given all the needed circumstances and so on, they would behave ethically in an autonomous way. You don't have to force them to behave in an ethical way, you don't have to impose any kind of instruments. They would behave ethically on their own. If we would like to compare between the compliance approach and the integrity approach, well, Rohr in 1989 simply distinguished both approaches based on whether they are rule based or value based approaches. So he believed that the compliance approach is more rule based, again, referring to the external controls that are imposed on the employee, whereas the integrity approach is value based, so emanating from within the individual and deploying internal instruments or controls. He also believed that when we adopt the compliance approach, we are following the low road. Remember the criticisms toward Kohlberg's model that stated that Kohlberg's model if we follow the rules, we are basically doing lower efforts in the organization because simply we just follow the rules. But in our social lives, where we are not controlled so often by various rules, we are exerting higher efforts in our moral deliberation. So, this is basically the same idea of Rohr. He said that when we follow the compliance approach or rule based approaches, we are following the low road. We do not exert so much effort in thinking how to behave ethically. We just follow rules and regulations. Whereas when we adopt the value based approaches or the integrity approaches, we are here adopting the high road. We are exerting a lot of effort in our ethical reasoning and judgment, and so we are following the high road. As a matter of fact, the compliance approach focuses on prevention, avoiding legal sanctions, and also sanctioning using surveillance and control, and conceives ethics as what is legal. So we can also say that when we rely so often on the compliance approach, we are adopting the policing behavior, okay? So we seek to prevent unethical behavior, avoid legal sanctions in case we violated laws or rules and regulations, or we also sanction unethical behavior using surveillance, monitoring, and control, and only believe that what is legal is supposed to be ethical. While the integrity approach, on the other hand, focuses on defining moral values and encouraging commitment. So here it is more proactive rather than preventive. Okay, and it is based on self governance where the individual himself um, decides how to behave ethically. Okay, but of course, this would not negate the importance of having an ethical leadership, because in that sense, this ethical leadership would play a role model for all the individual and would be a symbol that they can follow. Okay, but still, integrity approaches focus so much on the internal moral values of the individuals and encourage their commitment and self governance. Now, um, um, this figure or table, in fact, table, okay, tries to compare between the integrity approach and the compliance approach. So, if we're talking about ethics, well, the integrity approach focuses more upon self governance and subjective responsibility, meaning that the individual himself would do his best to behave ethically and would impose internal controls on himself to behave ethically. Okay, whereas the compliance approach would focus more on conformity with externally imposed standards like laws, regulations, and so on, and would focus in that sense on objective responsibility, where the individual would behave ethically because other people expect him to do so. The aim of the integrity approach is to enable ethical conduct and moral reasoning. So, again, here we are focusing on the positive side, or we are following a positive tone, which is to promote ethical conduct and moral reasoning and deliberation. Whereas in the compliance approach, we are more following prevention. So we seek to prevent and combat unethical conduct and integrity violations. So here it focuses more on prohibition rather than proaction. Okay. And it focuses on combating what is negative, so the unethical conduct, rather than promoting what is positive, which is fostering ethical conduct. Um, as for the behavioral assumptions of both approaches, well, in the integrity approach, we assume that social beings are guided by values, principles, so they are good in nature, okay? And they are also guided by public service motivation and leaders and peers. Whereas in the compliance approach, we believe that they are fully autonomous. They might not receive the support of their leaders, peers, and so on, and they would be guided by economic self interests. So, in that case, when they are guided by their economic self interest, so they can do whatever necessary to achieve these economic interests, even if they were unethical. This is what the compliance approach assumes, and this is why the compliance approach focuses very much on external controls to curb down unethical behavior. With regard to the methods and instruments used in both approaches, well, in the integrity approach, we rely more on the internal controls, as we said before. So we use education training, communication, and deliberation. We rely so much on the ethical leadership that plays a role model. And we also rely on an ethical culture and climate, as well as the reinforcement by rewards. So, because we focus on the positive side, so we would focus on rewards. Whereas the compliance approach relies more on the external controls that are resembled in rules, codes of conduct, reduced discretion and autonomy, because again, we have a negative assumption regarding the behavior of the people. And also, we would rely on auditing, monitoring, and controls, as well as reinforcement by sanctions, since we are focusing on preventing the negative aspects. So, we are focusing on reinforcement by sanctions instead of rewards. As for the standards that are going to be followed in each of these approaches, well, in the integrity approach, we rely more on general standards or broad standards that are represented in the organizational mission, for example, its values and aspirations, social obligations, also including laws, rules, and codes and norms. So here we do not necessarily um, um, restrict the individuals to follow specific rules and guidelines, but we help guide the ethical behavior by using the organizational mission, values, also codes and norms, but that are broad or general in their nature. Whereas in the compliance approach, again, because we focus on prevention and prohibition, so here we would rely on criminal and regulatory laws as standards, because we would like to sanction any possible violations, or we focus more on prevention. So, and we also focus on reinforcement by sanctions. So, this is why you would find that in the compliance approach, we would rely more on criminal law that tells you the kind of felony or the kind of crimes that um, might be committed and how they would be sanctioned, or regulatory laws that regulate the behavior inside, for example, the organization, and the different kinds of sanctions that would be imposed in case the individual is violating these regulations. As for the leadership and staffing that would play a dominant role in enforcing ethical behavior or preventing unethical behavior inside the organization, well, if we're talking about the integrity approach, we would find that managers and ethics officials or officers would play a very important and crucial role in the organization, because they are the ones to either play a role model for the rest of the employees and would foster ethical behavior accordingly, or they would also educate and train the employees on ethical behavior. Whereas in the compliance approach, since we are focusing so much on prohibition and we're focusing on avoiding legal sanctions and so on, we will find that lawyers and compliance officers would play the highest role or the most important role in the organization. Lawyers, in order to avoid any possible legal sanctions, and compliance of officers in order to regulate behavior, to prevent any unethical conduct, and so on. If we look at the activities that are implemented in both approaches, well, with regard to the integrity approach, we will find that we are adopting bottom-up developed organizational values and standards, as well as training and communication, integration in organizational system and culture. We would have guidance and consultation, assessing values and performance, identifying and resolving problems and dilemmas. So, in that case, here we adopt all those activities that can enhance ethical behavior. So, for instance, we allow everybody to participate in developing the organizational values and standards. So, in that case, we are following a bottom up approach. Also, we would encourage training and communication in order to educate the people and socialize them about how to behave ethically. We would also integrate the ethical principles and values in the organizational system and culture, and always refer to these values whenever we would work and whenever we would have social relationships inside the organization. In addition, guidance and consultation would be provided to everyone who might face ethical dilemmas or might have ethical questions and so on. Also, um, when evaluating employee performance, we would rely more on assessing values and performance rather than just focusing on the results and the outcomes and the performance without paying great attention to the ethics. Okay? For the compliance approach, Um, here we would develop top-down compliance standards, meaning that the employees at the lower levels are not participating in developing these standards and these um, um, rules and regulations. Also, we would use education and communication, but in order to handle the reports of misconduct or to teach and educate the employees on how to avoid unethical activities rather than on how to think in an ethical way or to make ethical decisions. So, here the main subject of training and education would be on prevention rather than promotion. Yeah, so prevention of unethical acts rather than promoting ethical acts or conduct. Okay, and also there would be a great emphasis on the reports of misconduct. So, inspecting any possible misconduct or unethical activities and so on, and conducting a lot of investigations. Also, overseeing compliance audits and monitoring, as well as enforcing standards with clear sanctions. So, here you would find a lot of supervision, surveillance, control, steering, rather than guidance, rather than consultation, as it is the case in the integrity approach. Again, it is very clear that in the integrity approach, we are following a bottom up development of standards, where in the compliance approach, we are adopting a top down development of standards. And in the integrity approach, we are stressing um, education, training, and communication that promote ethical behavior, whereas in the compliance approach, we are stressing education, training, and communication that emphasize prevention of unethical behavior. Um, and therefore, in the integrity approach, we are focusing more on guidance, consultation, assistance, problem solving, and so on. Whereas in the compliance approach, we are stressing surveillance, monitoring, compliance. Uh, uh, Also sanctioning of unethical activities and so on. In finally, if we're talking about education and training, well, in the integrity approach, we train the employees on ethical decision making, so which we shall discuss later in this chapter. So we help them make ethical choices and learn about the different ethical dilemmas that they might face and how to think in an ethical way, how to behave in an ethical way, and how to make ethical decisions. Whereas in the compliance approach, education and training would focus more on educating the employees about the compliance standards and rules and regulations, so the system, and also educating them about the codes of conduct and what they're mentioning. So here we are teaching them how to comply with the rules and regulations rather than teaching them how to solve problems, how to think in an ethical way, and how to make ethical decisions. So, again, the basic subject of training and education in the integrity approach is on promoting ethical behavior, on internalizing moral values, rather than on complying to codes of ethics and regulations, as it is the case in the compliance approach. By this, we would have finished the first part of this chapter. Hope to see you soon. Take good care of yourselves, and until we see each other,